The first thing I remember isn't a sound, it's the color. A faded green tent half buried in moss, the nylon sunken and torn like a lung that had long stopped breathing. A red thermos sat beside it, dented, its paint dulled by 12 winters of rain. The lantern next to it, cracked but still upright, looked almost like it was waiting for someone to come back and light it. I stood there with the others that morning in 2006, but even now, all these years later, that image never leaves me. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I was 43 when the story first crossed my desk. Back then, I edited the Tacoma Daily Chronicle, and summer meant slow news. Local parades, fairground concerts, stories about fishing permits, and forest closures. It was the kind of quiet stretch that let you breathe a little. My office windows faced the Puyallup River, and on warm afternoons I'd prop them open just enough to let in the hum of traffic and the smell of cedar from the sawmill. That Friday in July 1994 was no different. The temperature hovered around 75, clear sky, the kind of rare Pacific Northwest day that feels like permission to be outside. Kids were out of school, parents were barbecuing, and you could hear lawnmowers running all through the neighborhoods of North Tacoma. The air carried the faint tang of salt from Commencement Bay. The Whitakers lived just a few miles from there in a one-story brick house on Alder Street. A neat yard, wind chimes on the porch, a basketball hoop that still leaned a little from last winter's windstorm. I remember Linda Jason's mother telling me later how ordinary that morning had felt. She made pancakes. Her husband double-checked the camping list, and their son, tall, skinny, and eager, kept saying he didn't want to be late getting on the trail. Jason was their only child. A quiet boy with the kind of curiosity that worried his mother and made his father proud. He'd been collecting gas station maps since he was 12, tracing routes with a pen, memorizing the way mountain roads looped and twisted toward the horizon. His father used to take him fishing in the foothills near the Carbon River when he was younger, but this time Jason wanted to do it on his own. 2 nights, that was all his first solo camping trip. I still have the photograph the Whitakers gave me years later. Jason stands in the driveway, his backpack nearly swallowing him, holding his father's green lantern like a trophy. He's grinning, but there's a touch of nervous pride in his eyes, half boy, half man. You can almost feel the hope in that picture. They watched him walk down the sidewalk, turn the corner, and disappear. Linda told me she stood by the door for a long while afterward, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade. She said it felt strange, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful, like the house had just exhaled and gone still. But she brushed it off. After all, this was part of growing up, wasn't it? The Carbon River Valley sits about an hour and a half east of Tacoma, a strip of wilderness where the forest presses close to the water and the air smells of wet stone and pine. It's not deep backcountry, at least not compared to the high Cascades, but it's wild enough that once the trail bends out of sight, civilization falls away quick. Jason had picked that place carefully. He'd mapped his route, packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, thermos notebook, a handful of cassette tapes. He told his parents he'd call from the ranger station payphone on Sunday before heading home. For a 16-year-old, it was a plan made with the kind of earnest precision you don't forget. The last confirmed sighting came from Harold Dunn, a retired longshoreman who spent his weekends fishing the Carbon River. He told me years later that he'd seen a young kid that Saturday afternoon flannel shirt rolled at the sleeve's ball cap low over his eyes. The boy had stopped to ask about trout runs but didn't have a rod. Just curious, he'd said, smiling awkwardly before heading up the trail. Harold remembered thinking he looked awfully young to be out there alone, but confident, sure of where he was going. By dusk, Jason would have reached one of the clearings along the river, the kind where light spills through the trees in gold ribbons before the canopy closes. Maybe he set the lantern outside his tent the way his father used to do. Or maybe he sat on a fallen log sipping coffee from that red thermos, writing in his notebook about the sound of water and wind. The world would have been still, then just a boy and his own echo in the woods. I didn't know Jason personally back then, But when I read the first missing person alert that Sunday night, his name struck something familiar. Maybe because I'd written so many small stories about that same trailhead, or maybe because I had a son around his age. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this one would stay with me. Life in Tacoma rolled on that weekend. Folks at the Chronicle left early to catch the Rainiers game. The fire station held its annual pancake breakfast, and out east, one boy unrolled his sleeping bag beside a river believing he'd proved himself ready for the world. Mark and Linda tried to stay busy that weekend, pretending not to watch the clock. Saturday night, they sat on the back porch, the sky turning violet over the Sound. They talked about how proud they were of him, how careful he'd been about planning. Sunday afternoon, when the sun dipped low and the wind picked up, Linda started watching the kitchen window, listening for the car in the driveway that never came. I imagine her turning on the porch light out of habit, a silent signal that home was waiting. The same light that would still be burning when I pulled up their street the next morning. Notebook in hand, unaware that I was walking straight into a story that would haunt the valley for decades. That night, July 10th, 1994. The phone on their kitchen wall stayed silent. The line that was supposed to carry their son's voice home never did. And somewhere in the dense green miles between Tacoma and the Carbon River, something had shifted quietly forever. I remember the sound first, the slow, deliberate hum of the refrigerator in the Whitaker's kitchen. It was early morning pale light pushing through half-drawn curtains, and that hum filled the silence between us. Linda stood by the phone, one hand gripping the counter as though steadying herself against the thought forming in her mind. Mark was already in motion, half-dressed for work, the car keys turning in his hand. The night before, they'd left the porch light on for Jason, thinking he might roll in late and surprise them. But when dawn crept in and the house still held that hollow quiet, something in the air shifted. Parents know when the world's gone wrong for their child. They don't need proof, they feel it in their bones. By the time I got to their house that Monday morning, they had already called the sheriff. Deputy Mercer was there, a calm man with the kind of face that didn't give much away. He was gentle with them, assuring them that most likely Jason had just taken a wrong trail, maybe decided to camp another night. It wasn't unusual, he said. The woods could play tricks on time. But I could tell even he didn't quite believe it. The coffee on the table had gone cold, untouched. Linda kept smoothing the same corner of a folded trail map, her fingers trembling slightly. The official search started within hours. Pierce County Search and Rescue mobilized 24 volunteers that first day. I followed them to the Carbon River trailhead, that familiar gateway of wooden posts and weathered signs. The air there was heavier, thick with pine, and the distant rush of water. The kind of place that feels both alive and watchful. It was mid-July, clear skies, but still cool enough that you could see your breath when you spoke near the river. From the start, everything about that scene felt too quiet. Helicopters came first, thudding low over the valley, their rotors stirring the treetops into motion. From where I stood, I could see the search teams fan out in small clusters, bright jackets moving like slow sparks through the underbrush. Dogs barked, handlers called commands, radios crackled. The whole thing had the rhythm of a machine, built from hope and dread in equal measure. I stayed back with a few other reporters jotting notes I barely understood at the time. 16 years old. First solo trip, 2-night plan, no return call. That was all we had. By late afternoon, they'd found nothing. Not a torn strap, not a footprint. Mercer called it in, his voice low even. Negative so far. Then again, a few hours later, same phrase. It echoed between the trees and the static. As the sun sank behind the ridges, a strange light spread over the valley, a thin, amber haze that turned the pines almost bronze. Searchers kept at it until dark headlamps sweeping through the brush like fireflies caught in the wrong place. When I walked back to my truck, the Whitakers were still at the trailhead. They'd parked their Subaru close to the entrance tailgate, open folding chairs pulled out. Linda sat with a flashlight on her lap, her face pale in its glow. Mark paced beside her, scanning the tree line even though it was pitch black beyond the first few feet. I didn't speak to them that night. There are moments when words have no place. The next morning brought more teams. Loggers from Eatonville, volunteer firefighters, even a few high school kids who'd seen Jason's missing poster on the news. The sheriff's office brought in mounted searchers and an air unit from Seattle. Every effort felt urgent, purposeful, but by the second day, urgency began to give way to something quieter confusion. The Carbon River runs strong that time of year, swollen from snowmelt, its surface glinting like metal under the sun. Some believed he'd slipped in, pulled under by the current. Others thought he might have wandered uphill toward the ridges. But if he had, the terrain up there would have been unforgiving, steep, loose shale, dense cedar thickets. I hiked with one of the teams on the third day, trying to understand what they were up against. The forest floor was soft and uneven, layered with years of pine needles. Every footstep left only the faintest mark, swallowed almost instantly by damp earth. Searchers moved in grids, ropes stretched between them to keep lines straight. They called his name over and over. Jason, Jason, their voices thinning against the wind. Somewhere out there, the sound disappeared. When we stopped for lunch by the river, Mercer joined us. He was tired but steady, leaning on a walking stick he'd cut from a branch. I remember asking him if he thought it could have been foul play. He hesitated, jaw tight. "We don't have anything to support that," he said finally. "But I don't like holes in stories." That was all. As the week dragged on, holes were all they had. Helicopters scanned from above, thermal cameras searching for any heat signatures. Nothing. Divers checked the deeper pools of the river. Nothing. They even brought in scent-tracking dogs from Oregon, but the animals circled confused, then sat down as if the trail just stopped. It was as though the forest had folded in behind him. By Friday, news vans began parking along the dirt road leading up to the site. Reporters asked the same questions, different ways, circling grief like vultures. I tried to keep my distance, writing small updates for the paper, but staying out of the family's way. Each evening, the Whitakers stood at the ranger station with a thermos of coffee waiting for news. Linda wore the same denim jacket every day. Mark's beard grew rough, his eyes darker. They'd sleep in short bursts in the car, never fully resting. When I spoke to them briefly one morning, Linda said something that still echoes. "I don't care how long it takes," she told me. "We'll bring him home." But they didn't. Not that summer, not the next. The official search was scaled back after 10 days, then suspended after 3 weeks. Volunteers came less often. The forest reclaimed the footprints, the tape markers, the flattened grass where tents had stood. What had been an operation turned into a vigil. The trailhead grew quiet again, save for the whisper of the river and the wind through the branches. In the months that followed, Tacoma wrestled with its own theories. Some said Jason must have run away, maybe hitchhiked north. Others swore the woods around the Carbon River were cursed. There were old stories about miners who'd vanished there decades earlier, their camps found empty after storms. Nothing concrete, just the kind of talk small towns lean on when reason runs out. For his parents, none of it mattered. They kept searching privately weekends, spent driving out there, walking the same paths over and over, eyes scanning every shadow. By fall, the leaves began to turn, and the valley closed in on itself again. The news moved on to other things. The world did what it always does, it kept going. But the Whitakers stayed tethered to that river. I'd visit from time to time, bring them coffee, check for updates. There never were any. Years passed, and the case became one of those names people remember vaguely. The boy who went camping alone and never came back. The sheriff's office filed it as unresolved, no signs of foul play, presumed missing. Linda went back to teaching. Mark took early retirement. The house on Alder Street stayed the same, The same lantern in the garage, the same red thermos on a shelf. A home held in pause. I can't explain why that story clung to me. Maybe because I had a son myself, or because something about it never added up. You don't just vanish half a mile from a river. You leave a trace, a footprint, a thread. But Jason left nothing. Every summer the woods swallowed more of the search markers, more of the human noise. The trails healed themselves. Hikers passed through unaware of the name tied to that place. I remember one July afternoon in the late 90s, standing at the same clearing by the river where he might have set up his tent. The air was warm, thick with pine resin and the faint buzz of insects. I closed my eyes and tried to picture him there, a lanky kid alone but proud, lighting his lantern as the sky dimmed. For a moment, I could almost see it, the glow against the trees, the river threading through the dark. Then the wind shifted and it was gone. Over time, even the Whitakers began to speak of him in the past tense, though I don't think they meant to. They'd say Jason loved that trail, or he was so careful with his maps. Small slips that revealed what they couldn't admit out loud. Hope erodes slowly, like the banks of that river, one season at a time, until what's left is memory and ache. By the early 2000s, new families had moved into their neighborhood. Kids rode bikes past the house without knowing who had once lived there. I still ran into Mark sometimes at the hardware store. He'd nod, polite but distant, as if the conversation could only ever circle back to the same unfinished sentence. "You hear anything new?" he'd ask. I never did. 12 years is a long time to carry silence. By then, even I had stopped driving out to the valley. The forest had its secrets, and it seemed content to keep them. Then one July afternoon in 2006, a message lit up my phone. 2 hikers had found something off an old service road north of the Carbon River. I remember standing in my kitchen the same way Linda once did, my hand on the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. For a moment, it all felt like 1994 again. The same air, the same waiting. They said it was a tent. Green, faded, half buried under years of moss and debris. Less than half a mile from one of the original search grids. I grabbed my notebook, started the truck, and headed east. The forest had finally spoken after 12 long years of silence. The road to the Carbon River looked almost the same as it had 12 years before, potholes full of muddy water trees leaning in over the shoulder fog caught low between the trunks. But the place felt older, somehow more guarded. When I parked near the trail gate that afternoon in 2006, 2 sheriff's cruisers were already there, lights flashing faintly in the drizzle. I sat for a moment before getting out, listening to the sound of the wipers slow to a stop. There was something about returning to a story that had long gone cold. It stirred a quiet dread, like walking into a house you once knew but no longer belonged in. Deputy Mercer was there still with the department, though his hair had gone gray at the temples. He recognized me right away and gave a tired half-smile. "You picked a hell of a day to come back," he said. I followed him up the overgrown service road, the ground slick underfoot, branches snapping against our jackets. The air smelled of wet bark and rust. We didn't talk much. There was a reverence to that climb, the kind people keep when walking toward a grave they haven't yet seen. The hikers who'd found the tent were waiting near the site, a young couple from Tacoma, both shaken but calm. They said they'd noticed a rise of earth that looked too symmetrical to be natural. When they brushed it clear, they found fabric, green, nylon frayed but unmistakable. They'd expected trash, maybe an old hunter's blind, until they saw the shape beneath. The woman kept her arms wrapped tight around herself as she talked, eyes unfocused. "We thought it was empty," she said. "We didn't touch it again after that." The tent sat in a small hollow beside a stand of furs. Moss blanketed nearly everything, branches, stones, the collapsed roof of the tent itself. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. The outline of the structure was intact. The poles bowed inward, corners pinned under fallen limbs. Just outside the entry flap, half sunk into the soil, was a lantern, its glass cracked and fogged with moisture. A red thermos lay on its side a few feet away, the paint chipped but still visible through the dirt. Someone had placed a small evidence marker beside it, number 3, in black ink. I stood there for a long moment before stepping closer. Inside the tent, I could see the edge of a sleeping bag darkened and clumped from years of decay. Beyond that, bone, small, pale, half-buried under silt. The forensic team worked quietly, moving with care, voices low, almost respectful. Rain tapped softly on the canopy above each drop, amplifying the stillness. No one had to say his name. We all knew. When they brought out the personal effects later that evening, the evidence table looked like an exhibit from another lifetime. The wallet was brittle leather flaking at the corners, but the ID was still legible. Jason Whitaker, Tacoma, Washington. The photo showed the same boy I remembered from the missing posters, wide-eyed hair parted too neatly. His father's green lantern, the red thermos, even a battered Walkman with corrosion spreading across the metal casing, all matched the items listed in the original report. Mercer let out a slow breath and rubbed the back of his neck. All this time, he said quietly, "We were right here." The next morning, I met the Whitakers outside the sheriff's office. They looked smaller than I remembered, the years of waiting having hollowed something out of them. Linda clutched her husband's arm as Mercer told them the news. There's no easy way to say words like found or remains. They land heavy no matter how gently spoken. She nodded, eyes unfocused, her lips trembling as though forming a prayer that wouldn't come. Mark stood beside her, rigid, his hand over his mouth, staring at the floor. When the silence stretched too long, he finally whispered, where Mercer gave him the coordinates, though I don't think either of them could picture it. 1/2 mile from one of the original search grids. Less than 1,000 yards from where volunteers had camped that first week back in '94. That fact sat in the room like a ghost neither of them could face. Linda turned to me at one point and said, "He wasn't far, was he?" Her voice cracked on the last word. All I could do was shake my head. For the next few weeks, the valley filled again. Reporters, crime techs, curious hikers, all drawn by the story of the boy whose campsite had waited 12 years beneath the trees. The sheriff's office kept the area sealed while the coroner finished the examination. I spent those days chasing down old files, reading through the original search reports, trying to understand how something that close could have been missed. The terrain had shifted over the years, floods and storms reshaping the low ground. The Carbon River is unpredictable. It swells fast after heavy rain, carrying whole logs downstream. Some experts suggested that debris from a flood in the late '90s might have buried the tent, later uncovered as the land eroded again. It made sense on paper, but standing there looking at that little patch of earth, I wasn't so sure. The lantern had been upright untouched, the zipper on the tent closed from the inside. When the coroner's report came back, it offered no clear cause of death. No trauma to the bones, no signs of violence. The official language was undetermined possible environmental exposure. A polite way of saying they didn't know. But among the investigators there were murmurs, small inconsistencies no one could explain. The sleeping bag zipped fully around his body as though he'd gone to sleep and never woken. The cassette in his Walkman not one of his own. The label in different handwriting. Mercer showed me a copy of the evidence log once. The tape had been sent to an audio lab in Olympia for restoration. He said it was probably nothing, just procedure. But his tone said otherwise. When the story broke publicly, it spread fast. Missing teen's campsite discovered after 12 years. The headlines made it sound almost peaceful, as though the forest had merely been keeping him safe until someone was ready to find him. I watched the Whitakers stand before the cameras, again older, gray-haired, their grief tempered by time, but still raw underneath. Linda thanked the hikers who'd stumbled upon the site. At least, she said softly, he wasn't taken far. That line made every paper in the state. Afterward, the case should have ended. They had remains, personal items, and explanation that fit neatly into an official report. But it didn't feel finished. Late one evening, I got a call from Mercer asking if I could meet him at the office. When I arrived, he had a manila folder on his desk, the kind marked restricted. Inside was a transcript from the lab that had analyzed the tape. The first half of the recording was ordinary distorted songs muffled by damage. Then, around the middle, the audio shifted. Static, then rhythmic sounds, uneven but deliberate. He tapped the page with his pen. They thought it might be footsteps, he said, or something moving close to the mic. I asked if they'd recovered any words. He hesitated. "They're calling it interference," he said finally. But the text said they heard syllables. 3 of them. He didn't repeat what they thought they heard, and I didn't ask. The report concluded with a line that stuck in my mind: anomalous audio artifacts, source unknown. It wasn't proof of anything, but it wasn't nothing either. That recording never made it into the public file, but rumors have a way of escaping. A few weeks later, a short clip surfaced online, grainy, almost inaudible, just white noise punctuated by faint hollow beats. People claimed to hear a voice beneath it. Some said it was Jason calling for help. Others insisted it was something else entirely, something whispering his name. I listened to it once late at night in my office, the speakers low. The sound was faint, almost lost in the hiss, but there was a rhythm to it that didn't feel accidental. I shut it off halfway through. As summer turned to fall, the sheriff's office boxed up the evidence. The tent, too fragile to preserve, was cataloged and stored. The Whitakers received what they could: the lantern, the thermos, the Walkman. I stopped by their house one evening when the press had moved on. The living room looked almost the same as it had in 1994, except now the air held the heaviness of things that should have been set down long ago, but weren't. Linda showed me the lantern on the mantel, the glass cracked but cleaned. "I can't bring myself to polish it," she said quietly. "It's got the last dirt that touched him." Outside, rain drummed against the roof. Mark sat in his recliner staring at the muted television. He looked up as I was leaving and asked, "You ever think he was really alone out there?" I told him I didn't know. It was the only honest answer I could give. Driving home that night, I passed the edge of the valley where fog hung thick between the trees. The radio played something low and distant, the kind of song that barely fills the silence. I turned it off and rolled down the window. Somewhere beyond the river, an owl called once, then again. The forest was quiet after that, too quiet. In the months that followed, the theories multiplied. Flooding exposure, maybe even deliberate withdrawal, a boy overwhelmed seeking solitude. But none of them explained the same small details. The closed zipper, the untouched lantern, the footprints found just beyond the tent, long and narrow, blurred by time. Mercer dismissed them as erosion, but I could tell he didn't believe it either. The case file was closed by Winter, stamped no further action. But I kept thinking about that recording, about the static that wasn't static, and the voice no one could quite name. I still had one of Jason's old photographs pinned above my desk. The driveway shot him holding the lantern like a promise. I'd look at it some nights when the newsroom was empty, the hum of the lights filling the space where thoughts got too loud. By the following spring, hikers began talking again, small things, odd sounds near the same clearing, a glimpse of something bright red where no one had been. The forest, it seemed, wasn't finished with its story. And standing in that valley once more, camera slung over my shoulder, I couldn't help but wonder if some part of it had been waiting all along, listening for the next name it might keep. It was a cold night when the audio finally reached me, the so-called cleaned version sent quietly by a contact in Olympia who said he thought I should hear it before the sheriff's office decided what to do with it. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, lights off, except for the small lamp above the sink, the kind of light that makes everything feel half real. The file was short, barely a minute, and started with the hiss of damaged tape. I kept the volume low, leaning in. For the first 30 seconds, it was only static and faint distortions of music, fragments of guitar or wind, impossible to tell which. Then came the sound the technicians had mentioned, soft, deliberate, like footsteps through wet ground. It wasn't random noise. The rhythm was too steady, too human. After that 3 muffled syllables drawn out and heavy with distance, I couldn't tell if it was a name or just the shape of one. Then, nothing. The recording ended with the mechanical click of a button being pressed. I sat there a long while afterward, the refrigerator humming behind me, my heart slow and strange. The sound of that click, how final it felt, stayed in my ears long after the file was gone. 2 days later, I drove back to the Carbon River site with Mercer. He hadn't wanted to go, but neither of us could let it rest. The sheriff had already closed the investigation, citing no evidence of criminal activity, though you could tell even they didn't fully believe that. We parked near the same gate, the path slick with early frost. The leaves were gone now, the ground a patchwork of brown and silver. The markers from the investigation had been removed, but the earth still held the shape of disturbance. Mercer stood where the tent had been, hands in his jacket pockets looking out toward the river. "This is the part that gets me," he said quietly. "Half a mile from a trail. We passed it every day that week in '94. His breath came out white in the air. I didn't answer. What could I say? That the forest had hidden him on purpose, that it had waited until we were ready to find him. Some thoughts are better left unspoken when the trees are listening. He told me the lab had turned over everything, the audio, the reports, even the damaged cassette itself, to evidence storage. You'd think after 12 years we'd get answers, he said. Instead, we got ghosts. When we left, the valley was already dimming. Fog drifted through the tree line like smoke. I remember glancing back through the window as we pulled away. For a split second, the light caught the wet ground just right, and I thought I saw something metallic near a stump, small, circular, maybe part of the lantern. When I asked Mercer to stop, he shook his head. "Let it be," he said. "We've done enough digging." The following week, the Whitakers held a memorial at the community church. It was quiet, modest, filled mostly with neighbors and a handful of people from the original search. I sat toward the back. At the front of the room, the old lantern sat on the altar, its cracked glass catching the candlelight in a way that made it look alive again. Linda spoke briefly, her voice steady but hollow. "I like to think he fell asleep listening to his music," she said. "That maybe the last thing he heard was something he loved." She paused, her eyes fixed on that lantern. "The forest kept him," she added, "but not unkindly." Afterward, as people drifted outside into the rain, I saw a reporter approach her asking about the rumors surrounding the tape. Linda didn't answer at first. Then she said something so quietly, I almost didn't catch it. Jason wasn't alone out there. I know that now. The story should have ended there. It should have faded back into the long list of unsolved wilderness disappearances, tragic but explainable. Yet the whispers wouldn't stop. Someone inside the department leaked a portion of the audio to a small-town radio host who specialized in unsolved cases. Within days, the clip had spread online. People claimed to hear things that weren't there, words hidden under static whispers, layered between frequencies. Some said the voice was saying, "Help me." Others swore it was something calling Jason's name. I listened to one broadcast of it late at night. The host played it 3 times each, slower than the last. The third time, the pitch shifted enough that a low tone emerged almost like breathing. When the segment ended, the host's voice shook as he said, "Whatever this is, it's not wind." I turned the radio off and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to convince myself that what I'd heard was nothing more than a damaged tape and the human need to make sense of noise. But then came the reports from hikers. Small things at first, music faintly echoing through the trees, a red thermos appearing on a rock beside the trail, only to vanish hours later. The Park Service dismissed it as imagination, but the accounts kept coming. People began leaving little offerings at the site: cassette tapes, candles, old lanterns, small tokens for a boy most of them had never known. The area gained a nickname: Whitaker Hollow. It started showing up on hiking forums, ghost blogs, even tourism maps. That uneasy fascination spread faster than truth ever could. When I returned the following spring, the clearing looked different. The moss had been stripped away by visitors, the soil trampled flat. Someone had carved a small cross into a tree trunk. The forest felt wrong that day, too bright, too still. I took a few photographs for the paper and packed up quickly. But on my way back down the trail, I stopped to catch my breath and heard it very faint under the wind. A sound like the muffled click of a tape deck. Once, then again. It could have been anything branch as a bird, but it stopped me cold. I stood there listening until the forest went completely silent. That evening I called Mercer to tell him. He laughed softly, the kind of tired laugh that carries more worry than humor. "You've been in this too long, Dan," he said. "That place gets in your head." Maybe he was right. I'd spent over a decade chasing one boy's shadow through those woods. But the thing was, I hadn't imagined the sound. And when I checked my camera later that night, one of the photos I'd taken near the clearing was corrupted, a streak of static running across the frame in the exact same pattern as the noise on that tape. Over the next few months, I tried to move on. The paper shifted focus, new editors came in, and the case files were sealed for good. Still, every time the summer rain came, I'd find myself thinking of that tent, the way the nylon had caved in but still held its shape as if it were waiting for its owner to come back. I'd think of the way the lantern stood upright, untouched by time. The official story said Jason died of exposure alone, probably in his sleep. But the evidence didn't behave like nature. It behaved like intention. The last time I spoke to the Whitakers was on a quiet evening in early fall. I'd stopped by to return a photograph I'd borrowed years ago, the one of Jason in the driveway holding the lantern. Linda answered the door. She looked older but calmer, as if time had finally found a place to rest inside her. The house smelled of cedar and coffee. On the mantel behind her, the Walkman sat beside the lantern, both cleaned and still. I asked if she ever played the tape again. She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "But sometimes when the house gets quiet, I swear I hear it start on its own." That night, as I drove home, rain swept across the windshield in long streaks. Somewhere between Tacoma and the foothills, I turned off the radio and let the wipers set the rhythm. The world outside blurred into gray. In the rearview mirror, the reflection of my dashboard light flickered once, then steadied like a pulse. I remember thinking how some stories never really end, they just settle into the land, waiting for the right silence to speak again. A month later, the local news aired a short anniversary piece about Jason's case. A young cameraman revisited the site for footage. When he reviewed his film that evening, he told the producer he'd heard faint music under the sound of his own breathing, a warped melody like a cassette being dragged through water. He deleted it without watching again. The station didn't air that part. Officially, the case was done, closed, explained. But for those of us who had walked that valley, who had felt its quiet watching us back, it never really was. Sometimes I still drive out there, park at the gate, and listen. The air is different now, lighter maybe, but if you stand still long enough, the forest hums. Not loudly, not even clearly. Just a faint metallic tremor like the start of a tape winding up to play. And in that brief pulse of sound between wind and silence, you can almost believe he's still there somewhere just beyond the trees, a boy caught forever between a song and the dark. Winter came early that year, the kind that settles into the valley like an old habit. The Carbon River froze at its edges. The air smelled of smoke and pine, and for the first time in more than a decade, there were no more reporters at the gate, no more markers in the dirt. The case was done, filed, boxed, sealed. The Whitakers had buried their son. But endings like that are never clean. They don't close with ceremony. They fade slowly, unevenly, like fog lifting off the water, revealing everything that's been there all along. In the weeks after the memorial, I found myself driving out to that valley more often than I wanted to admit. Part of it was habit. Part of it was something harder to name. I'd park near the old ranger station and walk down to where the trail split north the same stretch Jason had taken his first day out. You could still see faint imprints from visitors' boots, but the forest had already begun reclaiming the rest. The tree line near the hollow was thick with new growth, young maples and cedar rising where the search tents once stood. Nature moves on whether we're ready or not. I thought about that a lot, how time smooths over everything, even the places marked by pain. The official record said Jason died of exposure, likely the first night a tragic accident. The sheriff's office closed it as unsolved but not suspicious. Mercer retired the following spring. He said he'd had enough of cases that ended with more questions than answers. We met once for coffee before he moved out of state. He told me he'd stopped playing the tape altogether, that some things aren't meant to be listened to more than once. I understood. That sound, the slow hiss, the rhythm that wasn't quite wind, it had a way of embedding itself in your thoughts, resurfacing when the world went quiet. The Whitakers tried to rebuild some kind of normal life. Mark volunteered at a local hiking club leading safety workshops for teenagers who reminded him of his son. Linda turned her grief into something quieter, teaching her students how to read topographical maps, how to respect the places that look safe until they aren't. When I visited them the following summer, their home felt lighter. Not happy exactly, but lived in again. The lantern still sat on the mantel, but it no longer looked like an altar. It was just part of the room now, a relic, not a wound. Linda told me she still dreamed about Jason sometimes. In those dreams, she said, he never spoke. He just stood near the porch light holding that same lantern waiting. In 2008, a group of local volunteers placed a small plaque near the Carbon River trailhead. Nothing elaborate, just a bronze plate mounted on a boulder with Jason's name and the words, "He went where the river led him home." People leave flowers there sometimes, or cassette tapes wrapped in plastic. I've seen candles, hand-drawn maps, even a folded letter tucked under a stone. It became a kind of quiet ritual for the community, a place to put the weight of all the stories that never found their endings. Every few years, a new group of hikers passes through, unaware of the history underfoot. They stop for photos, maybe notice the plaque, maybe don't. The forest doesn't advertise its ghosts. It's only those of us who remember that still feel them, the subtle pressure in the air, the way the wind changes direction near the clearing. It isn't fear anymore. It's something gentler. Respect, maybe. Recognition. A few winters back, long after the story had faded from public memory, I received a small padded envelope at the newspaper's old office. No return address, just my name written in a shaky hand. Inside was a cassette tape with no label. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to play it. It sat on my desk for weeks gathering dust, daring me to decide what kind of closure I really wanted. When I finally did, it was nothing like the first one. There was no voice, no rhythm, no mystery, just the sound of running water, steady and soft, as if someone had stood near a river and let the tape roll. It might have been nothing, a prank, a coincidence. But the quality of the sound, the way the current shifted, and the faint whisper of wind wove through it, felt unmistakably like that valley. I never told the Whitakers about it. Some things belong to silence. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest truths. I'm older now, retired from the newsroom. The house is quieter and the world moves faster than I ever expected it to. But every now and then I'll catch myself humming the songs Jason used to listen to, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, those voices that filled the air in 1994 when the world still felt young and endless. Maybe it's because I've heard too many stories that end without answers. Maybe it's because deep down I still hope that understanding isn't always found in facts but in what remains. Last year I visited the valley again. The trail has changed. Flooding reshaped the riverbed, carving new channels through the brush. The clearing where the tent once stood is now hidden under a slope of wild ferns and alder. The plaque is still there, weathered but intact. Someone had left a new lantern beside it, a cheap camping model, bright orange, its light flickering against the trees. I stood there as dusk came on, watching the glow fade into the fog. For a moment I could almost believe the forest was breathing with me, exhaling all the years it had held onto that boy's story. Before I left, I walked down to the water. The current moved slower than it used to, carrying bits of cedar and moss downstream. I dropped a smooth river stone into the flow and watched the ripples fade. There's something humbling about standing in a place that's seen so much and still manages to feel untouched. Maybe that's the lesson the Carbon River gave me, that we never really uncover the truth. We just learn to live beside it. The Whitakers don't come out here much anymore. They've built a quieter kind of life, one that doesn't revolve around waiting for answers. Their home feels warmer now, the air filled with small, ordinary sounds. Linda's laughter when she talks to her students online, Mark tuning a radio in the garage. They still keep Jason's things not as artifacts, but as pieces of their story. The lantern, the thermos, even that warped Walkman. They're reminders of love that endured long after certainty disappeared. Sometimes on the anniversaries, I'll get a call from Linda. We don't talk about the case anymore. We talk about her garden, about the seasons, about how the mountain looks when the snow first hits its peak. There's comfort in that simplicity and knowing that life continues in its small, stubborn way. The pain doesn't vanish, it just learns where to rest. As for me, I stopped chasing mysteries years ago. But there's one thing I've come to believe the forest remembers. It remembers every searchlight, every whispered name, every step of those who went looking and never found what they hoped to. And somewhere in that quiet memory, Jason exists not as a victim, not as a headline, but as a boy who loved maps, who wanted to see how far a trail could take him. If you walk that path today, you'll find nothing extraordinary. Just trees wind and the steady murmur of water. But if you stop for a moment, really stop, you might hear it too. A faint hum, a breath caught between branches. Maybe it's only the river. Maybe it's time. Or maybe it's the echo of a lantern flickering back to life, a reminder that some stories never fade. They just change shape, carried forward in the spaces between silence and memory. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for fame, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering in the end is the closest thing we have to keeping the light on